was around September or October of 1970. My battalion had been activated to go to Vietnam, and we were doing some intense training to get ready. The training was taking place in heavily forested areas of Fort Jackson, South Carolina. It was dark that night, and my platoon was on the left flank of the main body, and we were moving to attack and capture the aggressor force opposing us. I was a PFC at the time, and I was the squad leader. Orders came down for my squad to move up and scout ahead of the main body. We were moving from tree to tree slowly and as quietly as possible. I moved ahead to this really large tree, and I got down to a prone position and I listened. All I could hear was silence. There were no bugs, no frogs, nothing. I put my hand down to push up to my feet, and all hell broke loose. What I had put my hand down on was a booger's foot. He roared so loudly I couldn't hear for the next 15 minutes. I shot up and I backed up, shouting for the rest of the squad to retreat, all the while firing my M16. Don't worry, they weren't live rounds, they were blanks. With all the noise and my entire platoon racing towards me, the booger took off, crashing through the woods. After everything had quieted down, you could see the destruction it had made getting the hell out of there. Later, after a bunch of guys all dressed in black showed up asking a lot of questions, taking some measurements and who knows what else, I found out that the booger was 8 foot 11 inches tall, and they said it weighed around 900 to 1,000 pounds. Looking back, I don't think it was there to hurt anyone, it was just curious. And then he signs off and says, "Please don't reveal my name." That's no problem, brother. Man, what a story. What a story. I get a lot of these stories of these things actually inhabiting the forests that surround military bases. And I think there's probably a lot of stories out there of guys in the military, you know, the actual grunts that do the fighting, out doing training and running into these things. We hear of them a lot, but I bet there's more out there. Anyway, I appreciated this story. It's really good. Really good. Thanks for sending it, brother. Whenever I get busy at work or I'm working on another podcast project like Steve Lilly, which I'm doing now, I don't have time to do a video, so I'll go back and find some of the real good stories I've done years ago. Been doing this 4 years. I think every 9 or 10 months I do this. And I put out a video called Best of Dixie Cryptid. There's a playlist of them if you'd like to listen to them all. They're older stories that I pull up that I think are really good. I've remastered all these, the audio, because when I recorded them 2 or 3 years ago, I didn't know what the heck I was doing. Anyway, that's what you're about to listen to. Hope you enjoy it. All right, here we go. Here's a North Carolina encounter. The woman doesn't want her name used in the story, so I'm just going to read her story to you. It's really good. It's really good. It was 1978 and I was 12 years old. We lived on 70 acres in McDowell County in North Carolina along what used to be Muddy Creek Road. I know it's something else now, but I'm not sure what it is. My dad bought this land out in the middle of nowhere against my mom's wishes, but you know, in 1978, whatever he said went. He cleared the land and laid block and built a basement and then placed a beautiful double-wide trailer up there for our family. The driveway was 2 football fields long. I could see the house from the end of the drive when the bus let me off each day. My mother, my sister, and I, we all hated it. It was the country. No, it was the middle of nowhere. The nearest neighbor was 3 miles away. Seriously, 3 miles except for the house my oldest sister and her husband were building through the woods on the land my dad had given her. His thought was to build a big farm and his children all to build on the land and raise our families together. This was not going to happen. After we moved in, my folks had the family over for a big family cookout or barbecue. The whole family came, my mama, aunts and uncles, cousins, which we know are our first friends, and everyone else. That night, when many had left, my daddy and uncle decided to tell us some ghost stories. There we all sat around the fire with Dad and Uncle Jack trying to scare us. In those times, we were still kids at 11 and 12 years old, and we didn't have the influences kids have today to harden us up. We loved Andy Griffith and the Waltons, don't you know? Uncle Jack started telling us about the man who lived in the woods because he didn't like noisy children. Of course, we were all scared to death. While Uncle Jack talked, we leaned in to listen and we stayed close, thinking it made us safer. It was pitch black dark except for the stars that shone that August night and the flashlights us kids all held up so tightly. My dad had gotten up and gone. We thought that he went inside. My Uncle Jack said he hunts the woods looking for loud kids now. We have heard he recently moved in close by. And just then, out of the woods came a man with a long beard, and he was screaming. Us kids took off running for the house before we realized it was my daddy, and that beard was my mom's wig on his face. Oh, they got us. But later that night, all us kids were piled up in one bedroom talking, and we heard footsteps on the outside. We figured it was the adults trying to scare us again and just yelled, "Stop it! Dad, quit it!" and things like that, only to have Uncle Jack and Daddy come down the hall. They weren't the ones outside. It was really strange. A few days later, I got off the bus and headed up the long drive. It was slightly raining, and I stepped off the bus and opened my umbrella and started my long walk home. I walked about 15 feet or so, and I started feeling really alone. All but whatever was shadowing me in the woods. I could hear it walking on two legs. I walked on, scared to death, and trying to stay calm. As you can imagine, for a 12-year-old girl, this is scary. I crossed the creek and got up the hill, and as I started in the door, I heard a deep growl. It ran through me from head to toe. I was hysterical. I made it inside, I grabbed the phone, and made sure no one else was on the line. In those days, country folks had something called a party line that hooked to all the homes in the area. I called my mother at work and told her what had happened, and she said it was probably some kind of animal and for me to just calm down, that I was inside now. In just a short time, my older sister got home, and she walked the same drive, but she didn't hear anything. That night, when Dad got home, Mom told him what had happened, and Dad grabbed a shotgun and went out to check things out. He went out and took a look around and came back and said that he saw some bear tracks, so it had to have been a bear. He told me to be careful and to come straight home when I got off the school bus. I cried and cried, and Mom decided that us kids would ride the bus to her office and we would ride home with her. That made me feel a little bit better. That weekend, my sister and I made a trail over to where my other sister and her husband were building a house. We made a good trail from our door to hers. It took about 10 minutes to walk the trail, and no one was to walk it alone except for Dad. While we were on our way home from dinner that Sunday, my sister and I were alone on the trail. I was ahead of her, and I heard her say, "Hey, do you hear that?" I said, "What?" And I ran back to her because I was moving way ahead up until this point. We stood still, and we heard the rustle of bushes, and then it got very quiet. We walked on rather quickly, and just as we could see the end of the trail, we heard a whoop coming from beside us to the left about 50 feet off in the woods. Then we heard a long, high-pitched whistle come from higher up on the hill behind the house. Then we heard a grunt come from the right side, and we took off running at that point, and we ran inside the house. Mom and Dad said it was our imagination and to quit being so scared. Wednesday after school, my sister and I rode the bus to Mom's work, as was the plan, but she had run us home and gone back to work. Someone called in and said she had to work late. So my sister and I were home alone. In those days, we didn't have cable, so we sat there watching TV, and the TV went out. We thought the antenna had just quit working or was out of position. My sister told me that she was going to go out and turn the antenna and for me to yell when it got clear. She turned it and repositioned it several times, but it never helped. She continued to turn and nothing. She came in and she said, "It looks like the wire's loose. It looks like Daddy didn't even have it in good enough or something." So we turned on the stereo and we listened to music. We did that for a while, and all of a sudden we heard a whap on the outside of the living room wall. We stopped dead in our tracks. "What was that?" I said. Whap! There it was again. She ran and locked the front door, and there we sat until Mom and Dad got home. We told them what happened, and Dad again grabbed his gun and he went outside. He came back in a while later, and he said to my mother, "All I see are some rocks out in the yard, and the antenna wire has been jerked down. I think they have very active imaginations, and you hate it here, and so do they." They had words, but we went ahead and went to bed. We were working out in the yard planting some fall flowers, and my mother finally heard the sounds that we had been telling her about. We heard knocks and whistles and yells. The first yell she heard, my mother turned white. I mean white like the sheets that we had changed on the bed that Saturday morning. She told us to get inside, and we did as we were told. That night when Daddy got home, Mom told him what she had heard, and he then again said, "You just hate it here, and you're just looking for a reason just to go." They had words again, and again we just went to bed. Finally, one late fall day, it was getting darker earlier, and Mom, sister, and I were headed up the drive, and right ahead of us at the creek, standing in the drive, was not one, but two Bigfoot. A female with a much larger male. I remember screaming, and my sister said, "What is that?" And my mom said, "Oh my God, no, that's not real, that's not real, oh my God." They moved off to the left of the drive, and Mom gunned it, and up the drive we went. We ran in the house and locked the doors. I was crying, and my sister was in shock, and my mom called my daddy at work. She hung the phone up, and we gathered around the window that looked down on the creek. And there in the tree line we saw the male standing looking at the house, and he was swaying from side to side. He was at least 8 foot tall, and he had long red hair and a strange-looking face. We heard the call start again, and we actually saw this male Bigfoot start to yell. We now knew that it was his yell because we watched him do it. His female was there with him, so who was he talking to? And that's when the rock started hitting the front of the house. Bam, bam, rock after rock came in and hit the house. It was about 20 minutes, and we heard Daddy's truck come up the drive. Mom was flying around the house now, and we were just sitting there waiting. We didn't know what to do. Daddy came in. "Who put those rocks in the yard?" Daddy said. "Bigfoot," Mom said. "Bigfoot, yes, Bigfoot, a real live Bigfoot. I saw them. The girls are not crazy. I saw them. I'm getting out of here, and I'm going someplace where there are people. If you want to stay here and get eaten, you can, but my girls and I are leaving." I looked up to see my mom with a bag packed for each of us. Daddy tried to calm her down, but Mom was going to have none of it. As we started out the door, I noticed a smell that was gag-worthy, and the yells started again. Mom told Daddy what it was, and he rolled his eyes. He walked us to the station wagon, and Mom drove us to Mama's house in the city. We never went back to that place, and Mom wouldn't let us. It wasn't long before Daddy came off that mountain about 3 weeks later, and he never said why, but I think I know why. Oh, wow, what a scary, horrible event in your life. How much money did y'all lose having to leave that place? I've heard that over and over, that the economic hardships that these Bigfoot put on people who live out in the country, you just can't count it. If you added it all up, you couldn't count it. And I never thought of it that way until somebody actually explained it to me, and I thought, that makes a lot of sense. I'm so sorry y'all had to move. Apparently things are okay now. You guys found another place to live and everything's okay. But I thought this was a great, very informative story, and thank you so much for sending it, ma'am. It was really good. Okay, this is a great story sent to me by a man who wants to be anonymous, and I'm going to tell y'all right now, I'm fixing to walk outside and start shooting chickens if they don't shut up. They're driving me absolutely out of my gourd. But let's try to get this story recorded because it's really good. This happened back in the summer of 2002, but I remember it like it was yesterday. One day while picking up my pay in the war room at Fort Indiantown Gap, I overheard news that my National Guard unit was about to get orders to deploy as part of Operation Enduring Freedom. I was a rifleman with Company C, 111th Infantry, 56th Stryker Brigade out of Kutztown, Pennsylvania. I volunteered for state active duty as part of Operation Noble Eagle guarding the Limerick Generating Station. I was carrying a full combat load on that detail for almost a year when I asked to be relieved. I really wanted to deploy with my unit, that whole band of brother thing. I guess you have to be a grunt to get it because my civilian friends thought I was out of my mind. I was a 42-year-old infantryman, and I wanted to be sent to an area of hostile fire. I look back now, and I guess I was nuts. A buddy offered to take me on a weekend camping trip to a little pay campsite along the banks of West Branch of the Susquehanna, just west of Williamsport, Pennsylvania. It was meant to be a relaxing trip before I deployed, and while there we would drink a few beers. We'd look for Indian arrowheads in the nearby fields, and he was going to give me a flint knapping lesson. We soon got bored with the field walking after only finding a few broken projectile points. There was a flowing stream called Big Run, and I wanted to explore it. I've been hunting arrowheads for many years, and I found that almost every stream and spring in Pennsylvania had a small Native American hunting camp at the head where the water first pops out of the ground. It was hot that day, and my friend got tired after a mile or so, and he wanted to turn back. I was determined to find the camp, and I went on alone. I followed the stream for another mile or two when eventually it got so thick with rhododendron that it became nearly impossible to follow. At that point, I started to hear the sound of the highway off in the distance. I found a crushed soda can in the stream. From the can, I came to the conclusion that the head of the stream was somewhere on the other side of the highway and farther away than I was prepared to travel. At the bottom of the mountain, I remembered seeing an old logging road that ran up the gorge to the left of the stream. I decided that would be the easiest and quickest way back to the river. After fighting my way through the thick undergrowth, I finally found a logging path that was about 200 yards to the left of the stream. As soon as I located the path, I found a nice flat spot that had a push pile for making the road. So I decided to scratch around in the pile to see if I could find any traces of flint chips. I have found whole arrowheads in these topsoil piles in the past at other locations. All I found in the pile that day was a few small northern ringneck snakes. It was getting even hotter and I was almost out of water, so I decided to pack up my scratcher and head back down the mountain. I had taken 2 steps into my journey home, and standing about 60 yards in front of me was the most terrifying thing I have ever seen. Honestly, I would like to think that I'm a fairly brave man, but I was not prepared for this at all. What I saw standing in front of me shook me to my very core, and I instantly froze. A flood of thoughts went through my mind in a second. I wanted it to be a bear in the worst way, but it wasn't a bear. When I realized what it actually was, an overwhelming fear hit me, and I felt like I was going to vomit. It turned and started running towards the stream where I had just come from, and I couldn't believe the speed it achieved in such a short distance. I could clearly see those two massive muscular legs running. The legs alone had to be as tall as me. The thing was probably 6 foot high at the waist, and it had to weigh anywhere from 800 to 1,200 pounds, and it stood 10 to 11 feet tall. The legs were thick and muscular, and made me think of hair-covered telephone poles. The hair appeared to be dark brown, about 4 inches long. It actually sounded like a bulldozer busting through the rhododendron, snapping branches as thick as my ankles. I remember thinking there's no way I can outrun this thing, and if it wanted to, it could easily catch me. Being unarmed at the time didn't help with the fear factor, and at that point I knew if I survived that day, I would never venture into the woods unarmed again. To get back to camp, I had to go towards where this thing was standing just a second before. I remember thinking the sounds I heard earlier that I thought were a deer must have been this creature following me. When I made that left uphill to get out of the rhododendron, I must have inadvertently flanked it. My thoughts were, this thing is stalking me. That's when 20 years of infantry training kicked in. In an ambush situation, you always charge into the contact and never go any other direction because that's where the real trap is. It sounds crazy, but at that point, I just bolted in the direction of where I first saw this thing. To tell you the truth, I didn't know that I could even run that fast. I never looked back because I was in full panic mode, but I knew if I didn't slow down a little, I would eventually fall, being that it was a rocky and downhill area. I thought if I fall and get injured, then I'm going to be in bigger trouble. I slowed myself down a little but kept running for what felt like 3 miles until I came to the river. I've never told anyone about this encounter until recently after enjoying some of your videos on YouTube. Funny, I never even told my buddy that took me on the trip. I'm not sure why I kept it to myself all these years, but you can bet every time I go hunting or into the woods, that day is in the back of my mind. I swear to God that this story is 100% true, and then he signs his name. First, let me say, you don't have to swear if these stories are 100% true. I believe every story that comes in here. Some of them seem a little outrageous to me sometimes. I'll just be candid with you. But who am I to say that this didn't happen to these people? And a lot of people write in stories and they'll say, just like this man said, I swear to God, this is 100% true. There's no need for that. You're telling your story in a safe place. All that said, man, what a story. Guy's just out arrowhead hunting. He walks right up on a Bigfoot standing in an old logging road, and then he rushes to where that thing was. So thanks for the story, man. It was really good. Here is an email that I got from a viewer that is interesting. It's not a Bigfoot story. It's his opinion on what these things are. And you guys know by now that I don't make any judgment on what people think these are or where they came from. Bigfoot is a phenomenon, and any ideas that we have about who they are, what they are, is subjective. They're just opinions. He claims he has good information, good solid information, and I think it's worth sharing, just in the spirit of being totally open to anything that's out there. I wanted to read his email, and I get a few of these, and I may start reading these every once in a while. He doesn't tell me whether to use his name or not, so I won't, but he signs the email Anonymous Joe. He writes, "Let me say first that I enjoy the stories of your channel and your narrations of them. I thought I would share some information which may or may not be of interest to you and your viewers. I will leave it totally up to you whether you share this information or not. This information is true. However, I cannot provide you with any information in regards to how I obtained it. The creatures you and your viewers enjoy so much have occupied this earth for hundreds of years. At one time, there was harmony with man until a dissension between them occurred over whether humans were to be trusted or consumed as food. A separation of clans occurred, and it now stands today. Here is a quick summary. Blackfoots. They are large, black, 8 to 10 foot tall. They hate men. They're malevolent flesh eaters. Do not approach these beings, for you will receive no mercy. At one time, they gave men a chance, but were killed off and no longer respect humans. If you were in the unlucky circumstance to be confronted by a Blackfoot and you have a weapon in hand, you will be given little choice. Then he goes to the Browns. He says they're large, 7 to 8 foot tall, mild-mannered, and curious about humans. They wish to form relationships with humans at times for food and other resources, but communication and violence towards them keeps them at a distance. Above all, they are most approachable and have their own language. Then he talks about grays and silvers. They are 7 to 8 foot tall, and they're the wise elders. Seeing one of the elders is extremely rare, as they are well hidden and know the ways of humans the most. The gray elders provide knowledge to the other beings and have successfully kept the blacks from all-out attacks on humans. The many names of these beings or creatures over the centuries have changed. Sasquatch, Bigfoot, etc. Above all, we have intruded on their lands and they are not happy about it, which is why the sightings are becoming more frequent. Perhaps we can befriend them one day. And that's the end of the email. I thought it was interesting. I don't know. I'm not a part of any group or research group or anything like that. I just tell the stories. That's all I want to do is just tell the stories. So I don't have an opinion either way. Heck, we've got some people thinking they came off a spaceship. Some people think they can cloak. Some people think they're demons from biblical times. I think it's all subjective. We really don't know. But to hear all of these opinions is fascinating to me. I don't know. I guess you can use your imagination and think up anything you want. But until we know more about these things, all of this is subjective. But it is very interesting to hear these opinions, and that's why I read this. So I hope you guys got something out of that and enjoyed it. Let's move on to another one. I live in a very small town in the Rocky Mountains of Montana. This town is located approximately 80 miles from the nearest city of any size. It's basically a destination location for hunters. The road leading east and west through town is paved, but all roads north and south turn to dirt roads within a few hundred feet of the main drag. In this location, spotting game while you're driving anywhere is a major pastime. Virtually every large North American game animal can be found here. Watching for elk and deer along the side of the road is a normal everyday experience, and the spotting of wolves, grizzlies, and black bear is not too unusual. An individual driving in this area would be an absolute fool to drive without his headlights at night, which virtually guarantees a collision with a large animal. With that in mind, I was headed to town yesterday morning at 8:30. There was a bright sunlight with a beautiful blue sky. As usual, my head was on a swivel looking for elk or moose, and especially for deer wandering out into the roadway. I was traveling about 80 miles an hour when dead ahead of me at 150 yards, a very large animal shot across the road from my left to my right. What was unusual was its gait. It was cat-like in its stride, and it looked very much like a cheetah chasing down its prey with its forepaws stretched out to the maximum in front of him and its rear legs extended out behind. As it flashed across the highway, its nose was even with the center line, and its tail was even with the left fog line, and it was absolutely coal black, black as midnight. There was no rise in its shoulders as it tore across the roadway, and it didn't have the bulk of a bear. It took me a second to realize that I had absolutely no idea what this creature was. I immediately hit the brakes and came to a stop about 20 feet from where it entered the woodline. My attempts to spot it in the heavy undergrowth and forest was an exercise in futility. This thing was twice the size of a normal mountain lion, which we have plenty. My hunting partner believes it was a black cougar, none of which are thought to be in existence. I could not make out the features of its head other than to say that at that distance it gave every appearance of being a huge cat. After 70 years in the forest of the western United States, I've never seen anything like it, and I would hate to come across this thing, whatever it is, while calling coyotes from a blind in the woods. Here's another Facebook story I got back 6 or maybe 8 months ago. Again, I don't check Facebook much, but this was a really good one and I wanted to share it with you. And here's what the woman writes. She says, I'm 78 years old and I have trouble typing and even speaking, but I have a few stories that I wanted to share with you and your audience. I'm not a good writer and I'm hoping that you can share these encounters. My husband's name is Roger and my name is Diane. Miss Diane, I was able to edit your message here and create a story out of this. It's all exactly as you wrote it. I think these events are awesome. She writes, these are the stories my husband has told me. My husband lived in LaSalle, Utah with his grandfather on a large ranch. They raised pigs there among other livestock. Often they would kill a few pigs for their own meat and hang them in a smokehouse on the ranch. My husband told me that when he was a little boy, he remembers times when his grandfather would get angry because the roof of the smokehouse would be torn off and all the meat would be gone. Only the roof would be damaged. All the walls and doors would remain intact. His grandfather would repair the roof and begin smoking more meat, only to have it destroyed again not long after, and of course all the meat would be gone. No other animal, not even grizzlies, will rip a roof off of a 10 to 12 foot tall smokehouse when they can just as easily tear through the wall or the door. Going through the roof would have been too much work for a bear. No other wildlife does this. It had to have been Bigfoot. I think they tore the roof off and reached down into the house, took the meat, and were gone. Another story my husband told me, still on my grandfather's place in LaSalle, we had a terrifying encounter. In 1942, I was 5 years old. On the ranch, we had no electricity or running water, so to get water, we walked down to the creek and had to haul the water back to the house. I walked with my older sisters down to the bank one morning and we were filling buckets and setting them on the bank when we heard something coming down the wash. We got very still to make sure that we were not hearing things, and I remember my oldest sister cupping her hand over my mouth so that I would not make any noise. I saw her nod to our other sister and then motion for her to quickly get out of the creek. I was so young that I didn't know what was going on, but I knew the situation was urgent. I could feel their fear. My oldest sister let go of me and reached down the bank to pull her sister out of the creek, and I remember they both scurried up in front of me. I was trying my best to keep up, but the bank was too steep and I began to slide back down. I felt a hand grip around my arm and my sister pulled me violently to the top. We crawled a few feet to hide behind some brush, and we got real quiet. I was in front of my sister, and her hand was again across my mouth to keep me from making any noise. The loud footsteps got closer and closer, and I was terrified. To me, a monster was coming, and I remember praying that it didn't see us. We were a few feet away from the edge of the bank so that the water was not in our line of sight. We could only hear the creature as it approached. It was in front of us now, splashing through the water and rocks, but I had to see it. so I wrenched myself loose from my sister and I crawled just a couple of feet closer to the ledge to see better, and what I saw scared me to death. The image is burned into my mind all these years later. The beast walked past and never noticed us, but it was enormous. It really was a monster. Under one arm was another animal that it had killed. It was dragging another with its other arm. I don't know what they were, possibly deer or elk, and the lifeless heads hung and dangled under the dead weight. I think if I had been older, I would have recognized the carcasses, but I was so fixated on the creature that I paid no notice to those details. I wasn't being observant of the creature's details either. I think I was so shocked that I just kept quiet and watched it walk by. Once it was past us and a good ways down the creek, I saw it climb the opposite bank and then it was gone. I wish I could relate the details about the creature, but at that age I didn't know how to do that. All I know is that to me it was a mountain of a creature and it was covered in dark, shaggy hair. My sisters made us sit there for a few minutes to make sure that it was gone, and then we ran back to the house without the buckets. I remember them telling my mother the whole story. All my mother said was for us to be more careful next time and to go back down there and get those buckets. She needed the water. She wasn't being mean about it, she just didn't believe the story. The next event happened while I was with my husband. This is not a Bigfoot encounter, but it is just as scary. It was either 1967 or 68, and my husband and I had been to Big Creek on that summer day, and we had fished all day from the bank. It was always a great time for us, and I loved going with him. When it was too dark to see, we packed his gear up and loaded the car. I loved the drive home with the windows down and the cool night air blowing through the car. We talked and we talked. The drive home was almost 70 miles, and the halfway point was the summit of Monte Cristo Mountain. If the sky was clear, we would pull over at a clearing at the summit, and he and I would sit on the hood of the car and watch stars for a while. There was not as much light pollution in those days, and a billion stars blanketed the black sky. It was a sight to see. My husband drew my attention to and pointed to an area of the sky. It was a dark spot. Something appeared to be blocking our view of the stars in this one location. It was perfectly round. Stars were everywhere, and one round dark spot with no stars. It was very strange. A few minutes later, we saw lights begin to come from the blacked out area of the sky. They were like small pin lights growing and moving in random motions, coming towards us. It was hard to see, and it took us a minute to realize that the lights were headed our way. At the last minute, we both jumped from the hood and quickly got in the car. It was time to go, but the lights were on us, flying around the car and underneath the car. They were everywhere. My husband turned the ignition and the car battery barely turned the engine over. He tried again and the battery still chugged at the engine, but finally it started. He backed us up to the highway and off we went down Monte Cristo with those lights following us. Some were still with us, and I could see several right outside my window. Some flew through the open glass in his side, and they exited my side. I don't know how far we had driven, but it wasn't too far before the lights slowly began to fade behind us until there were none. I was so relieved to be away from those things, and I took a big breath thinking we were safe. I don't know why I felt there was danger. The lights never harmed us, but it was so strange that it scared both of us anyway. Just about the time that we had settled in for the next 30 miles home, the headlights on the car began to blink on and off and dim. My husband looked at the battery meter in the dash and said the battery was discharging too fast and it was not getting a charge from the alternator. It was dark and we had miles to go, and this car was about to quit on us. My husband was smart and he turned everything off that would use battery, including the headlights. He was able to only run the parking lights so that we would be visible to other cars, but I didn't think we would see another car this late and on this stretch of road. As we came out of South Fork and headed towards Eden, he had to turn the lights back on to see, but they were very dim. Finally, we were on the last stretch of the road that would take us home. It was an incline down the mountain out of Eden that would take us to the house. The engine finally gave up and we coasted all the way to our drive, almost making it to the house, and we walked the last half mile to the house in what we thought was safety. The next day he replaced the battery and the car started, but there were still problems. Over the next month we had that car in the shop 4 or 5 times, and all the issues were electrical. Circuits were damaged and the car never stopped blowing fuses to every electrical system in the vehicle. It began to get so expensive that we finally sold the car. I think the dark area we saw in the night sky was an alien spacecraft, and it sent those lights to our location, causing us all this trouble. I will never forget how those small lights circled in and out of our car. It was so strange. I have several other events I could share with you that involve my family. All my children have been witnesses to most of it, and they have all seen Bigfoot, by the way. Best regards and thanks for your channel. Signed, Diane. Diane, that is 3 or 4 of the coolest little stories I have heard. I know they all scared you and your husband to death, but it was so entertaining, and I just love reading these, and I want to thank you very much. You're 78 and you say you have a hard time writing and even speaking, but I understood exactly what was going on in these stories, and I was able to put them together, and I hope you're happy that I was able to share them with everybody. Thank you very much, Diane. I really appreciate it. The last video I put up is a video called Sasquatch Roars Louder Than a Freight Train. And the last story, which is the story the video was named after, was from Eddie, and there's a second half to his email, and here's the rest of the story. He writes, the 2 guys I told you about who got roared at immediately went from wannabe believers to knowers after that morning. They wouldn't even hunt the rest of that morning, and they've been coming here for 25 years. Jordan was just a little fellow the first time he came with his dad, but now he's in his 30s. I had been telling him about these creatures since he first came, so after he and BJ got roared at, he got really interested. We decided we'd deliberately try to see one. We waited until about 12:30 one Friday night, and we went to a spot where the hardwoods met the planted pines with a bottom in the hardwoods. BJ had a predator call, and we chose the rabbit squall. We walked down a fire break about half a mile and decided that it was a good place to give it a try. I'd brought my dad's service revolver inside my jacket in a shoulder holster. I didn't want there to be an apparent firearm on me because I know that they know what firearms are. We all got back to back like a covey of quail, and BJ hit the rabbit squall, and instantly we heard footsteps coming up out of that bottom, and they were heavy. The walker came wide of us and did a complete 360 around us and went right back down the hill where he came from. No one moved. You couldn't have driven a 4-penny finish nail up our fannies with an 8-pound hammer. We were shocked it had happened so fast. And then I heard a group of kids laughing coming out of that bottom where the big guy had just come from. I didn't say a word. I didn't know if I'd lost my mind or what, but then Jordan asked me, he said, "Eddie, did you hear those kids laughing?" All I could think of to say was thank you. Jordan has young ears, because I knew there were no young human children in that bottom at 1 a.m., miles from a paved road in the Flint River swamp. I was so relieved that Jordan said that, and then BJ said he heard them too. I wasn't crazy, and I felt blessed. We didn't stay long after that because if there were little ones, there was a mama, and I didn't want to fool with the mama. That was in November, and the following spring I went turkey hunting alone. Normally my friend Keith would call and I'd shoot because he was good on the call. I was a novice turkey hunter and he'd called in the only two that I had ever shot. But this morning Keith couldn't go and he'd given me a push-button call and a piece of a hen decoy. I say a piece because half of it would fall down after you stuck it in the ground. Matter of fact, that decoy almost cost me my first turkey. He came running head down towards that decoy and then held up 30 feet from us and started strutting, and it made me laugh so hard I couldn't keep my shotgun aimed, thinking he was gonna die over a half-floppy rubber hen decoy, and he did. Anyway, I went to a place close to the river where a 300-year-old oak tree was on the corner of some hardwoods and some pines. This oak was so big that I could sit in my dove bucket in the recess between two roots, and I was in the tree. I pinned my old decoy and got on my bucket. I was fully camoed head to toe and was wearing a head mesh also. I'm pretty sure the turkeys couldn't see me, so I waited for daylight and I lightly hit my push-button hen cluck. I'd heard some gobblers fly down off the roost about 100 yards away, but I didn't get a gobble. I waited for a few minutes more and I pushed my call again very lightly. It was around 7:30 a.m. by now. Then I heard something coming from behind me and from the direction of the river, which was about 200 yards behind me. It was not being very stealthy, and it was coming my way. I didn't call anymore because I knew this wasn't a turkey, and it didn't sound like hogs or a deer either. I was on the ground, and hogs, well, they're hogs and they'll eat anything, so I was paying particular attention. Because my mother had a great uncle get eaten up by domestic hogs. They never knew if he fell in the pen, had a heart attack or what, but they only found his glass frames and his belt buckle. That story was in my mind this moment. As this thing got closer, I realized it wasn't hogs or a deer or anything on four legs. It never stopped moving and was making a heap of a fuss coming on two legs. I was thinking maybe a poacher had come on our property off the river, but he was a real big guy and seemed dialed in on my tree. Still, I was camoed, recessed in the tree on the far side, holding a full choke 12 gauge, loaded with 3-inch Magnum No. 4 turkey shot, and I didn't have a plug in. I felt fairly safe. As he got closer, I could tell by the stride and the impact noise that this guy was huge. So I got a little uncomfortable, and as he walked up to the back of the tree, he just stopped dead still, and then I smelled it. Not dead rotten meat or skunk, but 12 peach pickers in July by noon. He had really bad BO, really sour and wet dog smelling, and then he exhaled. If you've ever heard a Belgian draft horse exhale, that's exactly what it sounded like. A dozen rabbits ran over my grave right then. I was chilled and every hair I had tingled. I was one scared white boy at that moment. I didn't know if I needed to break and run or hold still. I felt dizzy. Everything seemed surreal. I was alone 2 miles from a paved road, and there was something on the other side of this tree that had real big everything. And then the smell went away, and then all the sound went away. I kept listening and smelling and nothing. Not a peep, not a fragrance, so I just sat there, and I sat there, and I sat there, for what I thought was about 30 minutes. Finally, I stood up and grabbed my bucket handle, and I started briskly walking away from the tree, and I didn't look back until I was completely out from under that big oak tree. I looked back, and I was about 75 feet away, and even then, I did not break stride until I'd walked that half mile back to my truck. Something strange about the time. It was 11:15 when I got to my truck. I figured this entire event started between 7:30 and 8, and I had heard the exhale maybe 15 minutes after I first heard it coming. I sat over 2 hours after the exhale, and I'd have sworn it was only 30 minutes or 45 minutes tops. But it was 11:15 now, so I suppose I sat there for a lot longer than 45 minutes. All that fuss that thing made coming to my tree, and I never heard it leave. The smell, which was awful, just stopped, and I never heard it climb the tree, which would have been a miracle anyway because the width of the tree base. I've never figured out how all that could have happened. That was the one time that I was scared in the woods because I was alone, and then it made me feel kind of queasy because of the time loss. It was just weird, but that's my scary story. Okay, and that's the end of the email. This is interesting to me because, number one, you got two witnesses on the first incident with those two guys that were hunting with you. Y'all went looking for them. You made a predator call. This thing comes out of the bottom, and he makes a 360-degree circle around y'all, and I know you can hear him. And then you hear those kids laughing. I don't know if you've ever heard Carrie Arnold's story over at Bigfoot Odyssey, but he heard kids laughing for years in the woods that he was hunting, and that is really quite a striking coincidence because I've not heard that before. Now I've heard it from two people. The other thing is, in your second story, is you think you had some lost time. Now, I do a few UFO stories in this crazy experiment with this silly channel. A lot of people don't watch them. Those videos don't get many views at all. And I've talked about a connection between UFOs and Bigfoot. Now, I don't have an opinion on it, but there's some pretty good evidence that there's something going on there. Most people lose time when there's a UFO around. You lost time when there's a Bigfoot around, so that's another striking coincidence that I think is, like you said, it's really strange. That would make me feel queasy too. I'm not laughing at you, but it's just like, whoa, man, that's just cool. So Eddie, there's your story. Thanks for writing it. My name is Phil. I'm from Northeast Iowa. That's right, the Field of Dreams. I wasn't planning to write you, although I've considered writing you in the past, but I never got around to it. However, I just listened to another great video of yours when I caught you saying that you're 99.9% sure that Sasquatch is real. Well, my friend, I'm here to take you to the Century Club with the rest of your listeners. I work out west as a big game hunting guide. Hunting clients will fly in each week on small planes to one of the many remote Forest Service airstrips that Idaho has to offer. Ours happens to be in the middle of the Frank Church River of No Return wilderness area in central Idaho. We pick up the clients and their gear via horse and mule from the airstrip, and we ride 3 hours to camp, which gets us away from the extremely remote airstrip that is, in fact, open to the public. Before and after each season, 4 of us guides will ride the stock in, each leading a string of around 7 horses and mules, which are carrying stuff for our camp and our personal gear, or whatever gear the outfitter doesn't want flown in or out. The 22-hour horseback ride pulling a string of loaded mules along sheer cliffs is, well, that's why I do this. Often regarded as one of the most remote areas in the lower 48, the Frank Church Wilderness allows no man-made technology, no chainsaws, no four-wheelers, no bikes, nothing. Heck, I'm glad I get to bring my saddle and an alarm clock. Is my story the best you've ever told? Nope, but it's the truth like most of the other stories that you read. I can't start by telling everyone that I grew up chasing whitetails and turkeys because I haven't grown up yet and I'm still chasing them. I'll be 34 years old this fall, and my goal each year for my birthday is to have my hunter harvest an elk or a deer. 3 years ago, during my birthday week, the hunter that I was guiding was a very high-ranking law enforcement official and a newly crowned political figure in California. I wondered if he was a good, honest policeman and would be a good, honest politician. I had no way of knowing this, and I assumed the answer was no. I walked his butt in the dirt that day, and the next day and the day after that. He actually harvested a nice young bull on my birthday, and instead of taking the long way back to camp, we took a shortcut straight down the steepest, slickest, most rock-filled mountainside that I could find. He made it, but I think I humbled him a bit. The following year, in late August of 2018, I found myself once again counting down the days to elk season. A fellow guide and I were hauling in a camp, canvas tents and hay loaded on the backs of our mules in preparation for the long hunting season. One afternoon, the two of us had some time to burn, so we walked up the mountain to a spot where we could actually get a view. The timber was so tall, dark, and thick that you had to go out of your way to get any views at all in some areas. We weren't in an area that gets any foot traffic in winter, spring, or summer, but during the fall hunting season, someone will inevitably obnoxiously walk through this part of the area. We sat down to have a late lunch in the perfect setting for a good nap. As I sat there, my gaze was down this mellow, rocky slope that we were sitting on, which was actually an old small rock slide that a trail now cut across, and we were sitting on the trail. That rock slide was the reason that we could see clearly, because it was a natural clearing in the forest. 20 yards in front of me and slightly off to the left was a group of 5 or so medium-sized pine trees. Around this small cluster of trees were rocks and grass. Behind that small cluster of trees, the dark timber starts and doesn't stop for dozens of miles in any direction. Before I was able to get too comfortable to doze off, I saw something move. It wasn't something in the corner of my eye. I'm literally looking down at that cluster of trees, and I saw this thing move. It was the top quarter of an upright black figure slowly move or slide behind one of the trees. When I say a quarter of an upright thing, I mean the entire right shoulder, the right arm, and head of something that resembled a man. It was quite a ways up the trunk, so my brain immediately started eliminating what it was. I never took my eyes off the spot. Was it a black bear climbing a tree right in front of us? We'd been sitting so long and these trees were so close, that was impossible, especially considering the fact that black bears never stop moving unless they're laying down. Was it a wolf, a lion, an elk, or a deer? Nope. My brain was eliminating everything very quickly. By now I was standing up and beginning to get quite curious, and so was my buddy next to me, who was now looking down at the spot as well. "I'm going down there," I said nonchalantly. I saw something big and dark-colored very smoothly slide behind a tree. I'm not even thinking it's another human trying to scare us, because it's not. Nobody was within a few miles of us at this time. I randomly tossed a big rock down in the general direction right before I was going to walk down there. That was a big mistake. Before I could even take 2 steps, from directly behind us, I'm talking within feet, something standing above us just out of sight because of the uphill slope made a sound so loud and abnormal that we froze dead in our tracks. We heard that thing behind us attempting to communicate with us. It was angry that we were there, or it was happy to see us. I'm not sure. I really don't know. But my sense is that it meant us no harm. Those particular Sasquatch in that spot never put that dreadful feel in my body. So we froze for a few moments, wrapping our brains around the situation. As I turned around and peered up the rocky slope behind me, I didn't see anything. My friend and I looked at each other in shock. Naturally, I'm a curious person. When something like this happens, don't you think I'd immediately want to get to the bottom of what was stalking me? As the top predator that man is, don't you think I'd be closer to feeling of rage? I didn't, and I wasn't. I didn't even have the thought to just stay put, assess the danger, and figure out what was exactly happening here. In fact, the two of us just started walking away. No fear, no curiosity, no thoughts, no words, no nothing. Almost like it didn't happen. As we walked down to the horses, I was aware of footsteps in the woods escorting us. Not once did Sasquatch even come into my mind, even though I've been aware of their existence for over 20 years. We soon returned to where we staged our horses and mules, and the footsteps continued and actually surrounded us in the area. Looking back, I realized that all the times I'd been in that location with our stock, I had heard footsteps in the thick foliage in the trees, and I had assumed that that was deer or elk that were eating the hay that spilled on the ground from our mounts. Apparently, that was not always the case. For the next few days, I was unable to think clearly about the encounter. I was unable to wrap my head around the situation. I had just had an opportunity to try to communicate with these beings, and that was a dream of mine. However, I did nothing. My mind felt blank, and I believe I know why. I wasn't ready for that experience to be any more than it was. Who knows, perhaps they would have shown their face close up and scared me so bad that I never would return to the woods again. Perhaps the world isn't ready to fully accept the fact that these things are out there. Or have we been held from this information either to protect us or to keep us sheep? My thoughts support the secondary of the two. It blows my mind that so many people know about these things, yet they have done nothing. They have done nothing for their community, let alone inform their family and friends to keep them informed and safe. We think ridicule by our neighbors is worse than expanding our lives and expanding our community. This has nothing to do with politics or religion, so let's break free from that constant circle of thought because it's creating so much separation from one another. Thankfully, we have these platforms to reach some real folks, and thankfully we have some brave folks who talk about this openly, whether it's his beliefs or not. I have been roaming the forests throughout this country my entire adult life. I even taught at a survival school in Maine. I've hiked hundreds of miles on the Appalachian Trail. I've been on multi-week-long, extremely remote wilderness trips in Canada and Alaska. I've hiked all over California and Arizona, and I'm a professional hunting guide in Idaho and in Montana to this day. So put yourself in my shoes for once. My life revolves around the forest and the mountains of North America. The forest is the one and only place that I personally know that is real and always factual. It's one thing that hasn't led me or any one of us down. The one thing that hasn't tried lying to me or any of us. The wilderness is where a lot of us go because we have to. It's in our soul. That elder policeman and new politician from California that comes to Idaho to spend a week with me needs it to get out of his real life for a handful of days where folks lie and cheat him like it's their job. What do I say when he or my next week's client ask if anything scares me out here? I lie to them like another coward, and I say no, because I don't want to ruin his one escape, the wilderness. I know what's out there in these woods, and it doesn't keep me from going back every day. And where I go in Montana to guide, in the Swan Mountains, we have more grizzlies and black bears than anywhere in the lower 48. And when I holster my heavy steel on my hip each morning, it's not for bears. It's for the rogue Bigfoot or whatever creature that people talk about in the Missing 411 series. And that first bullet in my revolver goes to whatever creature wants it. The second bullet is for me, because what's out there in this world will not be affected by anybody's little gun, or their protective dog by their side for that matter. While many folks invest their time in watching the news and gossiping about the crappy neighbor they deal with or spending time with their wives and kids, I'm spending my time trying to figure out how we aren't informed and racking my brain wondering why people think anything is more important than the truth about Sasquatch's existence. My grandpa went to war, then straight into the factory with 6 kids to feed after selling the family farm. I know for a fact that he would want me to continue living my freedom that he fought for. It's time that more of us stand up for what's right and start to use our brains for things other than arguing politics, news, and what Luke Bryan is singing about. It's keeping us dumb and we're losing. And no, I can't mimic the noise I heard that particular day on the mountain. Something with a brain was attempting to communicate with me, and I didn't know if it was friendly or not. I heard someone telling their Sasquatch story once, and they mentioned hearing a xylophone-type sound in the woods next to them. That would be similar to the beginning of whatever started chattering at us. You can use my name, and yes, these things are as real as water is wet. Thanks, DC, and shout out to your happy dogs. Phil, that's a great email, and I respect your opinions on, the importance of identifying this creature and knowing the truth about its existence, but I don't really lose any sleep over it, honestly. I'm not sure that it's the most important thing in the world as far as whether Sasquatch is real. And that's just for me. I mean, I have a life, I have a job to do, and I have a family, and I just live a regular life like everybody else. But this topic is very interesting to me, and I love reading about it, and I love reading your stories. And any opinion like this, or any opinion contrary to this, is welcome to be read on this channel. This is like a newspaper. I'm just trying to get the truth out. The truth may be a combination of what so many people in this topic think. I think when it all comes down to it, we're going to find out, if we ever find out anything, that a lot of the things that a lot of different groups that hate each other actually had a lot in common. I hope that's the case. But it's a great email. Man, you're living the dream out there, Phil, and I'm jealous, brother. It's awesome. I hope you have a good hunting season next year. Thank you very much for writing in, buddy. Here's an email from Ray. Here's what he writes. I've been deliberating about sending my story for quite a while, and I finally got up the nerve to go ahead and send it. I'm glad you did, Ray, because this is really a good one. This is really interesting. I guess my story really starts when I was a little boy. My dad took my brother and I on multiple fishing trips and camping trips. We were never hunters because my mom didn't feel comfortable with guns, and my dad always was sensitive to her request. But we were always outside and enjoyed the outdoors. When we were kids, he would take us out to the Mississippi River Valley area, which is close to Bellevue, Iowa. I think it was pool number 11. We would spend weekends there in our pop-up camper. Across the river there was an army depot, and trespassing was forbidden. But when the water was high, we could get a rented boat in there and fish that area. As long as we were not standing on ground, we were legal. We would always hear strange noises, things that we couldn't explain, and big splashes that my dad would say were beavers. As I got older, I started camping and going fishing out there on my own, and of course you get smarter and used to the wildlife when you're not a little kid, and you realize that beavers don't make that loud of a splash. While camping there as a kid back in the mid-70s, we would have things thrown into camp, and we also heard strange noises coming from the woods that surrounded us. I remember a few nights when we were awakened by those noises. We never knew what they were. In later years, I became more interested in bass fishing. I competed in several tournaments. This is where my story begins as far as my encounter goes. I was fishing a bass tournament on the Mississippi River around the Wisconsin, Iowa, Illinois area. It was late spring and we were fishing a qualifying tournament. I was considered a boater, and I had drawn a partner that was a non-boater, and we were heading out on the second day of a 3-day tournament. I had the basic equipment, a 19-foot bass boat with a 175-horse Johnson on the back, and I had all the gear. This was in the early 2000s, and GPS was not standard equipment at that time. We decided to run down the river to find cleaner water. We were after largemouth because they're bigger fish and they weigh more, and the smallmouth bite was non-existent at this time. The Mississippi River is a vast system, and the backwaters and tributaries that run along the river are immense. We had decided to make a run south on the river and lock down to another pool. When we finally got to the area that we decided to fish, we had to navigate very carefully. Maps were unreliable due to the water level, and again, we didn't have GPS. To get to the area we wanted to fish, we had to go underneath a railroad trestle, or bridge if you will, but because the river was up at the time, we had to actually take the boat plug out and fill the boat with water so that our bass boat would sit low enough to fit under this bridge. Once we were past the bridge, we would bilge the water out. I know that sounds crazy, but when you're after fish and you're that driven, sometimes you do stupid things. In hindsight, maybe it wasn't the brightest thing to do, but I had actually learned the trick watching Bassmaster TV. After we made our way around through the back area, we found a great spot with clear water that we wanted to fish. My partner had fished it before, and he said it was for sure a good spot and that we should catch a limit. The lily pads were just coming up and the vegetation was reaching the surface. It was a little bit late in the spring, so there was still some spawning going on, but mostly post-spawn, and the bass started hitting top water through the pads. The bank was mainly rock and sand, and behind that was a dense forest. We were sitting in a nice little stretch all to ourselves, and we had a lot of water to fish. It was going to take us hours to cover this area. We were stoked, and we started fishing, trolling at a steady pace with topwater baits. 15 minutes later, my partner put a 17-inch fish in the boat, and by 8:30 a.m. we both had our limits. After that, we started culling fish. It was a perfect day. At around 9:30, I was pulling us up to a bank that we hadn't fished, and we heard some clacking like rocks being clapped together. We assumed it was someone working on a project out of our view, but as we came around a slight bend, we saw a dark figure standing on the bank. We thought it was a bear. It was hard to make out. It really didn't look like a bear, but nothing else made sense, even though they are rare in this area. It was frolicking on the bank. It was weird. It looked like it was gathering mussels or crawfish and having a great time at it. We just sat in the boat and watched it. As we approached this animal, we really couldn't make out what it was still because we couldn't see its head. Soon we were close enough that it heard us and it stood up. This thing was huge, standing there with water dripping from its black hair. I couldn't believe how big this thing was. We now knew it was not a bear. My partner and I looked at each other, and basically without even saying a word, we understood the look of, what in the hell is this thing? I was on the front deck high above the water working the trolling motor. We stopped fishing, of course. Bigfoot never entered my mind at this point. I had only heard of Bigfoot from pieces on TV. And then this creature started wading into the water towards us. Apparently it had some rocks in its hands and it threw at us 2 times. One of those rocks landed in the boat. It was now swimming towards us. It was at least 100 feet away and we were in 5 feet of water. Where this thing was, the water had to have been about the same depth, so I don't know why it started swimming. It could have walked all the way to us and never had water to its waist, but it was swimming. The noises it made while swimming were so strange. It was a huffing sound that I had never heard anything like before. It sounded very deep and angry. It was time to go because he was closing the distance on us fast. We both dropped down into the seats and I fired the outboard up. Thank God it cranked on the first turn, and I dropped it into gear. The sound of the outboard apparently persuaded the creature to stop its advance because it turned and made its way back to the bank. I wanted to slow down and watch this thing some more, but I figured we better get moving, so we motored out of the area. I got a bit concerned when we reached the railroad trestle, but we got back under it the same way that we got in, and then we kept moving. We still had a lot of daylight left, and we should have wanted to keep fishing, but this ordeal kept our minds occupied so that we couldn't concentrate on what we were doing. We stopped and ate lunch, and we talked about the whole thing for an hour before heading back to the ramp. We both had our limits, and we qualified for the next tournament. I was real happy about that for sure. I never ran into that guy again in any of the tournaments I fished afterwards, so we never kept in touch, and of course I haven't talked to him since. I kept the whole thing quiet for years, only to tell a couple of close friends later on. I figured whoever I relayed this story to would think I was nuts, and I don't know if the partner that day ever told anyone or if he even remembers it. I still fish every chance I get, but I don't fish tournaments much. I'm in my 50s now, and I will never forget that fishing trip as long as I live. After that experience, I look back at my youth on the same river, and I wonder if those things that we used to hear when we were kids were these same creatures. I used to fish a lot in southeastern part of Oklahoma, and we've experienced other strange things while fishing, but I never had a sighting or can confirm anything but strange things or sounds. Bass fishing is a serious sport, and I'm just curious if your viewers out there have had similar events. I'm quite sure that I'm not the only one that has experienced something similar while fishing. I would be really curious to see if anyone maybe would respond and tell their story too, because I just find it hard to believe that I'm the only one that this has happened to while fishing. The places we fish, especially in the southern reservoirs as well as the Mississippi River, where there is so much shoreline and deep woods, I think these creatures use these rivers and tributaries as pathways or roads in a way to migrate. I don't really know, I'm no expert, but it just makes sense to me. I hope you enjoyed my story and you can use it, and some other fishermen might share theirs. Once again, keep up the good work. I really enjoy your channel, and it helped me sort this out and deal with what I experienced. Ray, that's a great story. I actually have I have a video up that has a story in it that is real similar to this. And I think the guy was on Tunica Cutoff or Flower Lake right south of Memphis. He was fishing in some flooded timber, actually running spinnerbaits around cypress knees and stuff like that. And he the trees cleared out and it got clear, and there was a bank up, a muddy bank, and he saw a Bigfoot rolling around in the mud, cloaking itself in mud. Some people said they do that to keep bugs off of them and stuff. I don't know. The guy was a teenager. I don't remember the story exactly, but I'll tell you what, at the end screen, I'll pop it up at the end screen, and you guys can listen to that if you're interested in these fishing stories. But Ray, this is a great story, man. I really appreciate it, and thanks for sending it, buddy. Here's an email from Deborah, and this is a good story, so hang on to your weaves. It was Thursday, September the 8th, 2016. I was on a trip from Erie, Pennsylvania to visit a friend in North Carolina. I had rented a car as I didn't think my 20-year-old truck would make it. I had my GPS take me on a route to bypass toll roads on the way down. I was driving for about 5.5 hours when I left Route 64 and drove on Airport Road and came down to a little town called Beaver in West Virginia. I made a pit stop at the KFC there, and the woman behind the counter called me sweetheart when I told her I was from Erie, Pennsylvania, and she said I was now in Beaver, West Virginia, which is how I knew where I was. I made a right out of their parking lot onto the Ritter Drive, Route 19, as I was leaving, and I was going slowly as I hadn't picked up speed from pulling out yet, or I'm sure I never would have noticed this. I was coming up on some leaves spread across the road when I noticed the leaves were moving, but there was no wind blowing. I slowed down thinking there may be a critter in the leaves and I didn't want to hit it. I was looking really hard because I could see the leaves moving, but I didn't see an animal. Then I could make out a small bipedal figure about 7 or 8 inches tall that seemed to be trying to hide itself in the leaves as it tried to get across the road. It looked as if I could see a line of each part of the creature, but it seemed to be cloaked, kind of like what a chameleon does, but not quite the same. I think it was by Cardinal Lane on Ritter Drive. It moved with a ratchet-type movement, rather jerky. I don't know if that was its normal gait or if it was injured. I was driving at a crawl at this time because what I was seeing was so bizarre, and I was trying to make out what it was. I was thinking, what in the world is this thing? It almost looked like a frail stick figure as I could only make out some of it. I thought maybe it was an emaciated squirrel, but they don't walk on 2 feet. And if it was that skinny, it would be dead, not jerking across the road. It was not a featherless bird either. It had made it to the center line and was attempting to cross the rest of the road when a pickup from the other side came speeding along and just missed it with its driver's side tires, and I saw the leaves and it being thrown. So I don't know if it made it or not, as cars behind me were honking at me to keep moving. I thought about turning around to see if I could find it because that is what I would do for an animal. But this was not an animal that I had ever heard about or had seen before in my life, so I wasn't going to take a chance on it being dangerous, and even more so if it was injured. For the next 60 miles I had to really concentrate on my driving as I was still scared, and I don't scare easily. The more I thought about it, I thought it may have been cloaked and was picking up the color of the leaves to disguise itself. It reminded me of the way the movie Predator depicted the aliens cloaking themselves. I could see it, but I couldn't make out exactly what it was. As I've tried to rationalize this in my head, I thought maybe it was a reptile or a lizard of some kind, like a chameleon that can turn different colors to hide itself. An octopus can do the same thing, and maybe we have just never seen them to know that they are there. When I got to my friend's house that night, I told her about it. She never doubted me, as I'm not prone to making up stories. I'm a very rational person. Her son mentioned something about Bigfoot being sighted down there, and I asked if he had heard anything about a dog man. He said no, so I started to tell them what I had heard about dog men, and when my friend interrupted me and asked if I remembered when she had called me a few years back when she had some large dog-like thing in her backyard. When she brought that up, I remembered the incident as I told her to call the game commission and report it. She said this thing was standing looking around in her backyard a few years after she had moved to North Carolina. It was very large. She said standing on all fours. The head was higher than the 4-foot chain-link fence around her one-tenant house where she had kept a dog fenced in. The dog was hiding in the doghouse, and she was afraid for her cat, so she took a broom and walked out the door to shoo it away, and it started towards her. She jumped back in the door and shut it, and then she called me. I told her to call the game commission, as a wolf won't generally do that. It would prefer to avoid people unless it was rabid. Plus, the only wolves around there would be red wolves, and they aren't much bigger than a coyote. They gave her a runaround and told her that it was just a dog and to call the Humane Society. Besides being very large, she said it had a shaggy gray fur and it had a funny-looking face. She said it really didn't look like a dog, but when her daughter helped her look online, she said none of the pictures of wolves or coyotes looked like it either. She said it had yellow eyes and that it had a mean-looking face that was showing a lot more expression than a dog's face or other animals do. It was more human-like than dog-like, and that is what freaked her out the most. I didn't know anything about Dogman at the time, which was probably best. I would have worried about her a lot. She said she hasn't seen anything like it since, and that's really the last I heard of it. But those are two strange stories I thought I would share with you, and I hope you can get them in a video. Well, we did get them in a video, Deborah, and that's a real interesting story. I'm curious about this small thing kind of moving its way across the road. Does anybody have any idea what that could have been? I don't know. I've heard some stories about the little people, and I don't know anything about them, nothing at all. Maybe it was something like that. I don't know. I don't even know what to think about that, but I don't doubt what she's saying. That sounds like a really cool experience, and she said it scared her, but it's interesting to us. You know what I'm saying. But anyway, the whole story was great, and then her friend had an encounter with a dog man. It's just real interesting stuff to me, and I really, really appreciate her sending that email to me. Thank you, ma'am. Okay, let's take a break from the stories, and I'm going to read you guys an email. And what this email entails is one man's opinion about something about Bigfoot. And I think these are interesting, and if you guys have opinions on some of these things, and if they're different, something different that's not prevalent in the constant same old stuff talked about in the Bigfoot world, I'd be interested in reading it and maybe putting it in a video. But I think this is interesting, so I'm going to share it with you. The email is from Keith. Keith lives in the UK. He says, I listen to your stories every day. I'm retired and I've got plenty of time on my hands. I never had an experience with Bigfoot, and I don't expect I ever will, at least not where I live, but after listening to you recount many stories, I'd like to share my thoughts with you. You may or may not have read the books by Carlos Castaneda. In case you haven't, Castaneda's mentor was a Yaqui Indian named Don Juan, and he taught Castaneda sorcery, at least that's what he called it, to begin with. This was to grab Castaneda's attention, but later he called it knowledge. The second book Castaneda wrote, there are 10 of them, is entitled A Separate Reality. The key to these realities is the ability to stop the internal dialogue, or, in other words, the constant chit-chat of thought. If you think about it, we never stop thinking. Even when we are sleeping, our minds are active. Apparently, when we stop this internal dialogue, we open the door to new realities and abilities. So many of the anomalies surrounding the Bigfoot experience are almost identical to the experiences Don Juan put Castaneda through, like being frozen to the spot, or the feeling of being ill, or the now you see me, now you don't type thing that Bigfoot displays. I can't help thinking that due to the fact that Bigfoot doesn't have the distractions of the modern world to fill his or her mind, he or she has these abilities that Don Juan taught Castaneda. I don't think they come from other dimensions. Rather, I think some of them have mastered the art of stopping the world, as Don Juan calls it. In other words, stopping thinking. And they can therefore jump from one dimension to another. The reason I think this is because there are videos of mother Bigfoots with young ones. If they did come from another dimension, why on earth would they bring their kids with them? That doesn't make sense to me, so I think it's more a case that they're from our world but can jump into another dimension when cornered. At least some of them have this ability. And then he goes on to write, keep the stories coming, buddy. And by the way, I love your accent. Oh man, this accent thing. This is a big deal to some people. I don't know why, but it's just the way we talk down here, so I can't disguise it. Anyway, this was an interesting email, and it's not so much that it has to do with Bigfoot, but it intrigues me about this idea of being able to stop thinking. I mean, think about that. Our minds are working all the time. They never stop working. I never stop thinking. I think all the time. And I wonder what it would be like to just, in a conscious way, remain conscious and stop thinking, go into such a deep meditative state that you actually stop thinking and kind of go blank for a few minutes. Would you stop breathing? Would your heart, would your involuntary organs stop beating like your heart? Would you stop breathing? I don't think so. They're involuntary, so, but I don't know. I just don't know what that would lead to, but it is a fascinating concept. Sometimes I've read a few things about this remote viewing phenomenon that I think even our military has used, where people, I'm not even sure exactly what it is. That's how dumb that's what a moron I am with this stuff. I just don't have time to read up on it, but it's interesting stuff to me, and I myself would love to be able to just shut my mind down. Man, just for 15 minutes a day, that would be fantastic. And I wonder if I did, could I transport myself to another place? Maybe not physically, but psychologically go to another place. I don't know if that's even feasible or not, but the whole concept is fascinating. And if it has to do with Bigfoot, it would make perfect sense. Now, here's the thing. We can all have opinions on any of this stuff because none of us know anything about Bigfoot. And if you think you do know something, you really don't. You really don't. You're just acting like you do because we don't know anything about these things. And all opinions and ideas are up in the air. I mean, we can come up with anything we want. This one seems very interesting to me. Hope you guys enjoyed his theory, and let's move on to another story. Thanks, Keith, for sending the email. It was around September or October of 1970. My battalion had been activated to go to Vietnam, and we were doing some intense training to get ready. The training was taking place in heavily forested areas of Fort Jackson, South Carolina. It was dark that night, and my platoon was on the left flank of the main body, and we were moving to attack and capture the aggressor force opposing us. I was a PFC at the time, and I was the squad leader. Orders came down for my squad to move up and scout ahead of the main body. We were moving from tree to tree slowly and as quietly as possible. I moved ahead to this really large tree, and I got down to a prone position and I listened. All I could hear was silence. There were no bugs, no frogs, nothing. I put my hand down to push up to my feet, and all hell broke loose. What I had put my hand down on was a booger's foot. He roared so loudly I couldn't hear for the next 15 minutes. I shot up and I backed up, shouting for the rest of the squad to retreat, all the while firing my M16. Don't worry, they weren't live rounds, they were blanks. With all the noise and my entire platoon racing towards me, the booger took off, crashing through the woods. After everything had quieted down, you could see the destruction it had made getting the hell out of there. Later, after a bunch of guys all dressed in black showed up, asking a lot of questions, taking some measurements and who knows what else, I found out that the booger was 8 foot 11 inches tall, and they said it weighed around 900 to 1,000 pounds. Looking back, I don't think it was there to hurt anyone, it was just curious. And then he signs off and says, "Please don't reveal my name." That's no problem, brother. Man, what a story. What a story. I get a lot of these stories of these things actually inhabiting the forests that surround military bases. And I think there's probably a lot of stories out there of guys in the military, you know, the actual grunts that do the fighting, out doing training and running into these things. We hear of them a lot, but I bet there's more out there. Anyway, I appreciated this story. It's really good. Really good. Thanks for sending it, brother. Here's an email from a gentleman in Arkansas. He wants to be anonymous, but he says, I dedicate this true tale to Zana, probably perfectly mispronounced by me, whom I have not met, but who I've spoken to on the telephone. She's an employee at the VA hospital in the lesser-known Fayetteville area, where I go for medical reasons. I'm sure to be nearing the end of my days on earth, and surely soon to meet my maker. I will not lie about that, and lying was never my habit. I can shoot the bull, but I'm well known to be an overly serious type person. I'm just a bit strange. I am by birth a Texas native. I have 2 roll numbers in the Cherokee tribe and descended from a Scottish blacksmith indentured servant who came early to America and later became wealthy. I was a mere weed, yet I can truly claim great roots, but many burnt leaves. My family fought our British brothers and on both sides of our Civil War, and I am second cousin to the man in black, Mr. Johnny Cash. I'm grateful and proud, an unashamed Southerner and a proud American. I was also a military brat and later a Navy veteran. Being a military child, I was raised for 11 and a half years in the shadow of SAC, the former Strategic Air Command. I volunteered right out of high school and joined the Navy, which should have been a career move but turned out to be rather abbreviated. As that U.S. Air Force brat, I have an interesting and true story of a SAC nuke base that was commandeered in 1952 by the things that we call UFOs. It changed a lot of people's minds and thinkings, but I will get to that at the end of my letter. For 9 years, I lived in the Pacific Northwest and certainly loved it. Times were tough, but I was able to be employed with the U.S. Forestry Service during part of that sojourn. I was young. I knew many government forestry personnel, landowners, loggers, hunters, and fishermen, and a lot of them had personal testimonies of Bigfoot. So does the U.S. Air Force Survival School in Northeast Washington State. Personally, I spent every free moment I could get in those forested mountains and trudged up and down them carrying land surveying equipment and personal gear. For better or worse, while I certainly had my own share of harrowing adventures and scares, I not once encountered a Sasquatch, even though living actively right in the middle of their habitat, and I didn't have a clue as to them being any more than folklore. I ended up back down south during the toughest of economic times and in a sad and unfulfilled state of mind, and with very empty pockets. I had also just lost everything that I had gained in the Northwest. Twice now I have had the pleasure to return to Arkansas to live. Presently I live in Northwest Arkansas. Decades ago, I had a few acres of woods adjoining the Ouachita National Forest in Montgomery County, west of Hot Springs. It is right across the highway from the lake of the same name. That would be Lake Ouachita. It didn't take long, though, to discover the real reason why the former owner, a retired Social Security judge, gave me such a great deal on this land. He even threw in a decent boat, motor, and trailer in trade for me doing the survey. He and his wife just wanted to get it sold. Perhaps the missus couldn't tolerate the woods. Some city folk are bothered by that. They were not ever going to live there again. They moved back to the city, and I soon learned why. The judge and the missus had a well on the property, but it was awful. It was greasy water, almost unusable. Mobile homes are not such bad choices for a dwelling, as long as you don't stick it in a park with 1,000 other such contraptions. The electromagnetic attraction or the collection of weirdos in them may be too much for a tornado to resist. I suspect tornadoes are under some degree of control by normally unseen forces. That is what makes me a bit of a weirdo. On the back of this house, the judge had had a nice deck installed. He even planned to have a rock garden. Rocks are about the only thing that will grow in that bit of red clay and is continually producing chunks of quartz that just works up out of the ground despite gravity and is surely the result of the Earth's rotation. Maybe. Or perhaps it was the aluminum roof on the mobile home. It created a sort of hell since he had located it hanging over a hill but under one gigantic old oak tree. That tree produced the largest acorns I've ever seen, and a lot of them. Acorns drop from oak trees, this one in profusion. Sleep was not easily obtained. Worse, the area has or had an odd propensity to echo the slightest sounds. A seasoned 1-pound acorn falling on a metal roof from near 70 feet produces a loud bang. A continuous barrage produces a resounding din of racket. One could go insane from that alone. Perhaps that was enough to make anyone sell out fast and to make such a sweet deal to the unknowing buyer. They had that decent old bass and ski boat, though. They could at least go fishing often across the highway in Lake Ouachita. And there were the deer and the squirrels. It was a hunting and fishing heaven, but I heard they spent an inordinate amount of time away from the property. To be candid, after I bought it, so did I. In order to make the payments, and as there were few jobs that I could take locally, I went into long-haul trucking. I got to be home for a couple of days every 3 weeks. What a lonely occupation. Still, it paid the bills and provided a home for my ailing and aged parents, who at first thought it was a genuine godsend. We all thought so briefly, and we tried to make it a home. Soon, my only sibling showed up and presumed to help out and keep an eye on them. I got to use my bedroom, which overhung the hill, only occasionally, but for several reasons, huge acorns and being addicted to diesel vibrations, I slept often in my truck sleeper, even though I was home. I knew of the large numbers of deer in the area, as well as the usual small bear, cougar, bobcats, etc. Yet on the 2 trails that ran the length of the property below and on either side of the hill, I seldom found deer tracks, or any other tracks for that matter, but they showed what I thought was some kind of heavy use, hard clay and rock, not the best sort of ground for detecting the sort of game that used it. I passed it off as a minor mystery, unworthy of much thought, which proved to be my mistake. My plot of dirt and rocks was heavily wooded with pines, dogwood, and large oaks. Dead leaves were a problem in the yard area. The trees certainly bothered my elderly mother, and they bothered my dad for entirely different reasons. She and my brother were persuaded by a local lumberman in my absence that the pine beetle had begun destroying my pines. She was promised an undisclosed amount of money and the promise to clean up all of the mess of slash left behind. I note that it was not her decision to make, but I had no idea of the denuded property until I drove in one weekend. Lots of oaks and dogwoods remained, but the pines were gone. I was enraged, but what could I do? Nothing. And the slash from the logging was later cleaned up by myself, my old father, and my brother. The pines went into furniture frames. They were gone, and I was sick about it. I had noticed every warm night on the weekends that I was home and I slept with my windows wide open, that I would be awakened around 11 p.m. by a quiet giggling or baby talk sound seeming to come from either side of the hill, but moving from the U.S. Forest Service area down towards Lake Ouachita across the highway. Strange enough, I thought, but I had no idea what to think and oddly thought it was some unknown behavior of other wildlife, probably deer. I don't know why I assumed that. I observed that the unusual and mysterious sounds could be followed beyond my hearing, tracing them by the barking and baying of distant neighbors' dogs. I knew the area well enough that those deer, it's okay to laugh at my deer theory, were going down to the lake to drink and or bathe. Sure enough, the distant barking would resume around 2 a.m., and I could trace their progress back towards my place, back up the trails, and again toward and into the Ouachita National Forest. My father liked to rise early and retire around sunset with a glass of iced tea out on the deck. Often we would sit and chat about nothing and the work that we had all done that day. Several times, however, he'd remarked about how he thought he was being spied on by a big, hairy, camouflaged neighbor hiding behind the trees out past our property lines. And sure enough, one evening I thought too that I saw the fellow. Sometimes he would sway left to right, but usually he seemed to peer from behind the trees. Once I walked out there with my rifle, hoping to have a more friendly encounter with the shy, strange visitor, but he would seem to melt into the forest before I arrived to where he or it was. By then, I was totally unsure of my old pop's vision and sanity, but wrote it off as my father's imagination. This, too, was a mistake. My brother, who occupied a 16-foot travel trailer out by the Forest Service line, was, however, terrified. He seldom spoke of it, but had begun to keep his rifle at the ready and claimed that someone was pounding on and jarring his trailer at night, sometimes scratching on the walls. He later built a large fire pit and began keeping a large fire all night, almost every night. He was a heavy drinker, though, and I chalked it up to his being a drunk. This assumption was also a mistake. One warm night with a full moon in 1991, I laid in my room with the windows open. Sleep was difficult due to the bombardment of acorns on the roof. We were exhausted from cleaning up the logging slash left behind by the crooked logger. I must have been leery about something because I was sleeping with my loaded .357 Magnum under the sheets on the pillow next to me, along with our three-legged orphaned tomcat. Oh, the things that can happen on a full moonlit night. Unfortunately, until I recently learned of nasal strips, I had a monstrous snoring problem. I could rattle the windows. How anyone or anything could sleep near me was a mystery in itself. But that night, that strange cat had decided to sleep right next to me. I don't remember the actual time, but it was late. The old tomcat awoke me with a terrified caterwaul like I had never heard. He was arched up like a Halloween cat, and his tail was fully bushed out in sheer terror. And as he was screaming at the door, he was also hosing a horrible-smelling stream of something onto my pillow. The cat was in a state of fear unlike anything I had ever seen. I looked at the door, which had a 1-foot square window, and simultaneously reached for and cocked my revolver. Filling that window was the biggest, hairiest man I had ever seen. I drew a bead on his head. I was scared, and I was pulling the trigger, about to send a hollow point bullet blasting through that window right into the face of that creature, which by then I knew from its moonlit features was merely holding a near-human but huge hand to its face, in an attempt to see just what in the hell was making that god-awful noise inside that metal house. Mere seconds passed as this encounter transpired, perhaps split seconds. The creature surely realized it was in trouble. It threw up its extra long arms as it turned and ran, screaming, very ape-like, flailing its arms and running for the Forest Service woods. I could see this creature quite well in the light of the full moon. In retrospect, I'm glad to not have shot it. It was as terrified as me and the three-legged cat, which had continued squalling and bolted screaming from the room, still hosing down its full path with that ungodly-smelling liquid. It took days of hard cleaning to remove that odor. There are a few things that I am certain of. The creature was screaming in fear as he ran from danger. However, I'm positive he was cursing me for all that he was worth. The logging slash he had run through was more than likely unpleasant and aggravated him even more. Before the erroneous logging operations, they were familiar with the woods of my newly acquired property. At that moment, he had no time to be careful, he just had to go. What I experienced that night was a huge, humanoid, bipedal, hairy ape man. One who was certainly capable of animal and human-like thinking. I finally realized why the old Social Security judge was so eager to sell out. It was all very clear at that point. The creature was roughly 9 to 12 feet tall, likely weighing in at 800 pounds. Long, stringy dark hair covered its body. I could not detect any odor over the horrid stench from that three-legged tomcat. It had to be that tall in order to bend over the railing on the porch and have its face against my window. That end of the mobile home was perched over the side of a hill, right under that big oak tree. I'm a very good observer, generally speaking. I was good at shooting down aircraft and other military targets while in the Navy. As a member of the U.S. government survey crew and a Forest Service cartographer and a military recon photo analyst, I know how to gather pertinent details. There are not half a dozen folk anywhere in the nation with whom I have told these things to, and in such detail. The usual response is total disbelief and awe that anyone could spin such a tale, but I have indeed had a somewhat interesting life. Some have said I should write a book, others simply dread to get me started, so I normally keep it all to myself and really have few associates these days. I failed earlier to relate that while I personally had no Sasquatch or Bigfoot experiences in the Northwest, I personally knew reputable and sane, even highly educated people who had experienced such encounters. Most were harmless, but some encounters were malevolent in nature. From my acquaintances in all the Pacific Northwest who have had such experiences, I have concluded that said creature is family-oriented and indeed raise and populate the world in areas where they find comfort and sustenance much like us, but they choose to generally observe us and avoid us at all costs. If possible, and by all means, we should be aware of them, but also avoid them if possible. I was once an avid outdoorsman. I love to camp, fish, and hunt, but I will not go into the forest to stay overnight now unless equipped with at least the largest bore weapon available. Anything less, if used in defense, will merely enrage the wounded creature. The smallest creature ever reported is capable of ripping the largest and strongest human male to shreds in seconds, and you just may become dinner. I knew well a devout Christian family, all highly educated in Washington State. They were not known to lie or embellish. They had close, regular exposure to families of these creatures. That was adjacent to the U.S. Air Force Survival School in the mountains of northeast Washington State above Cusick, Washington. The Air Force made pilots parachute into those mountains to survive or die and were not allowed to have any human contact until the course was terminated. There's no telling the stories that those flyers could tell, or the instructors who manned the school. My Arkansas experience. My small wooded plot was adjacent to the Ouachita National Forest. Not so much as a fence separated it. There are many natural caves above my old property. Also, all throughout that region are crystal mines, many not yet operative. Anyone or any creature can definitely make any number of those home if needed. And that's the end of the story, and that's quite a descriptive email about an encounter and several people that he's known that have had encounters. And it all kind of lines up with everything that normally we get with these encounters. These things aren't after people, not necessarily. I think they're just really curious. But I appreciate the writer for sending this in. It was a joy to read, and it was really well written, and I know we all enjoyed it. I appreciate you. Here is an email from J.M. in Texas. This is not a full visual encounter, but it is just as scary, and I think you're going to enjoy this, and I think you're going to like the way she wrote it. She's a good writer. I've been trying to decide for several weeks now whether or not to send my story. My story is not as dramatic as many others in that I never actually saw the creature, but I was scared out of my wits with some friends one night, and I experienced some odd things for years that never made any sense until I figured out what it was over 20 years later. I used to live near Navarro Mills Lake in Navarro County, Texas. My parents owned 3 acres with a farmhouse and a barn on it for 19 years. I lived there most of my teen years and into my early 20s. I had more adventures out there and more fun than anyone could have in the city, hands down. Little did I know back then that I was living in a part of Texas that had some of the most Bigfoot sightings in the state. Heck, back then I never even heard of Bigfoot. I had heard of Yetis that people had claimed to see on the other side of the world, but I dismissed that as myth. I had no idea that anything similar had been spotted in North America, let alone Texas. Looking back now, I'm glad I didn't know because I used to hike for hours in the woods without a care in the world. We had a large wolf dog that we called Cody, and he was 100 pounds. He helped me feel safer living out in the country. We lived next door to a man who raised cattle. From time to time, Cody would stare off into this particular section of the neighbor's land and then trot off into the woods and come back about an hour later. He would always come back with something unusual, such as a cow's leg. The weird thing about it was the leg would always be in perfect condition with the fur still on it. I figured the cow must have been attacked by coyotes, but I always thought it was odd that there were never any chew marks on the legs. One time, Cody even brought back a calf's head into the yard. Just like the legs, it was in perfect condition with the fur still on it. Another unusual occurrence was the disappearance of our chickens. Of course, from time to time our chickens would get taken by wild animals, but I remember this one time when for a couple of weeks we had a chicken disappear every night. We would close our chicken coop tightly, but the next morning a chicken would be gone. There was no sign of something digging underneath the coop nor breaking in. From time to time, we would get reports that some pets had been disappearing from the area, and people would tell us to keep a lookout for wild cats of some sort. I never in a million years would have thought that a scary, unknown, human-like creature was to blame. But then there was this one night that I will never forget as long as I live. It was during the summer, and I like to go swimming at the lake with my friend Lori. It was either 1991 or 92, I don't remember which, but I was in my early 20s. Lori was guy crazy, and she would always try to find some guys to talk to at the lake. This one time she started talking to 2 young men, also in their 20s, who were home on furlough from the military. She begged me to have them out at my family's place in the country. I agreed to have the 4 of us hang out around the campfire behind our barn, and soon they arrived in their pickup truck. I remember it was the darkest night that I've ever experienced, and there was no moon that night. We tried to play a game called Capture the Flag in the land around our place, but it was so dark that you literally couldn't see your hand in front of your face. We all felt too creeped out in the dark because something just didn't feel right, so we decided to hang around the campfire and shoot the breeze instead. While we were sitting around, all of a sudden we heard the most gosh-awful scream on planet Earth. I can only describe it as a deep voice of a man who was being tortured in the woods, screaming out in dire agony. It was coming from the same direction where my dog had always run off to. All 4 of us were so scared that we began to yell curse words and run for our lives. That was the only time in my life that I ever experienced the sensation of having my legs start running before I consciously told them to run. I didn't know how I was capable of running that fast. The 2 young men say they were getting the heck out of there and started to peel out in their truck. My friend got in front of them so that they would be forced to stop and not leave. They agreed to stay, but only if we could stay hidden in the truck for the rest of the night. We sat in the truck bed near the road, and when anyone would drive by, we ducked down and we hid. We figured there was some kind of psychopath in the woods that was torturing and killing people. We wondered if we should call the police. Soon, however, we saw a police car drive by, which was something I had never seen out there before. We assumed someone else must have already called the police and that someone was tracking the crazy person down. I remember talking to several neighbors and members of our church to try to see if anyone knew of something that could scream that loud and sound like a distressed human. One lady I knew suggested that it might have been a wildcat because they can scream like a lady. What we heard didn't sound like a lady, but I accepted the explanation because it's the best idea anyone had come up with. Years went by, and I ended up living in the city and was married and with kids by the time I was in my 40s. It was then that I began to come across stories about Bigfoot on the internet, and I realized for the first time that these things are in America and even Texas. One day it finally dawned on me what my friends and I had heard that night and who was leaving its scraps for my dogs in the woods. I listened to the recordings of Bigfoot on the internet, and sure enough, it was exactly what I had heard. I used to hear the howls of coyotes at night all the time back then also, so I wondered now if those were more friendly sounding howls might have also been Bigfoot. I think back and I find it strange that I never saw any deer in the area, even though it was quite remote and wooded. I wonder now if the Bigfoots had eaten all the deer, and that's why they were moving on to people's cattle and pets. When I realized in my 40s what I had experienced, I was so excited to talk about it, but my husband and kids just thought I was crazy. Yep, that sounds familiar. These days, my husband and one of my kids seem to be coming around as they have learned more about how much people have heard and seen. There's a research group here in Texas known as the Texas Bigfoot Research Conservancy. One day I was driving down I-45 in Texas when I stopped at a rest area, and much to my surprise, there was a plaque placed there by the TBRC describing how Navarro County is a real hotspot for Bigfoot sightings in Texas, including Navarro Mills Lake. It was then that I no longer doubted the conclusion I came to all these years after living out there. Looking back, I'm glad I never saw one because I literally might have died of fright. Just the scream of an angry, most likely male Bigfoot had been enough to send 4 young adults, including military men, running for their lives that night. Nowadays, I have my own theories as to what I think they might be and where they came from, but I will spare you all that. For now, it's enough for me to know that these things are real. I'm in no hurry to see these things be revealed once and for all the skeptics. I think the fact that most people don't believe in them is the best case scenario, because it protects the creatures and protects the people who would no doubt be hurt if people started to head out and hunt them in droves. I think of the movie Beauty and the Beast and how all the townspeople headed out to kill the beast once it was proven to exist. While this story is fiction, I believe the movie depicts exactly what would happen. Sadly, a lot of people cannot be trusted to handle the truth responsibly. So if people want to call people who believe in Bigfoot crazy, then they can be my guest. I just know that anyone who heard what I did that night would never forget it either. Thanks for listening to my story, and please just call me JM. Okay, JM, that's a great story. It's something that I think this is real common. I think, and I've said this before and I'm repeating myself, but I think people experience things at some point in their lives, and then it's confirmed later in life, and they keep thinking about it. What was that? What was that? I mean, you may not think about it all the time, but it may pop into your memory once a month, once every 6 months, whatever, and you just can't figure it out. You can't explain it, and then you see other people who are having the same type things, and you put 2 and 2 together, and then you know it was probably some kind of cryptid, or namely a Bigfoot, that you heard. But I thought this story was great, and I really appreciate the way she wrote it and her opinions. It's just a perfect story to read, and I really appreciate you, JM. Thank you. In 1995, I was teaching a group of students at a university in Kentucky who were majoring in middle school education. The course I taught was Foundations of Reading in the middle school. I was a storyteller. One of the requirements of the class was to teach a reading lesson to a group of middle school students in a local school by using a storytelling technique. Prior to teaching the lesson in the field, the students were required to share the lesson with their peers. All the stories were great, but there was one that absolutely put the class on the edge of their seats. Thomas was a Civil War reenactor who portrayed both Union soldiers and Confederate soldiers when needed. In late September of that year, at the Battle of Perryville reenactment, he and some of the members of his unit were sitting around a massive bonfire discussing the battle to be held the next day. They were portraying Union soldiers in this reenactment. Suddenly, one of the members of the unit said, "Look, what is that shining over there in the dark? Looks like belt buckles." Everyone looked to see several metallic Civil War buckles shining in the firelight, but they could see no one. Thomas said they were scared out of their wits. After a few minutes, the belt buckles disappeared. A short time later, one of the younger members of the group decided he wanted a Coke of all things. Thomas directed him to the vendor building at Perryville. It was dark, and Thomas told him to be careful. And when the young man didn't return after 30 minutes, some of the other men decided to go look for him. They found him at a fence in sort of a trance. He was shouting out commands to soldiers who were not there. Thomas called his name, but the young man kept shouting out commands. Finally, Thomas and the other man pulled him away from the fence. He passed out. After they got him back to camp and were able to revive him, the young man didn't remember anything. The group crawled in their tents for a good night's sleep. The next day, after the battle reenactment, Thomas found out that the young man had shouted the exact commands that were used by one of the generals who fought in the real battle 150 years ago. The members in his unit couldn't believe that they'd had two experiences with ghosts in one weekend. This last story is really good. It's a little bit long, but I think you're going to enjoy it. The writer says, this is Billy's story. I live south of Dallas-Fort Worth. I was out driving around on an old back road and drove up on a rickety wooden bridge that crossed a seasonally dry creek bed 15 feet below. I parked and walked out on the bridge. I leaned on the railing to watch the sun go down and the stars come out. It was peaceful. The moon hadn't come up yet, so it was pitch black except for a few stars peeking through the cloudy sky. Behind me, I heard a rhythmic thudding, something that gave me a bit of a shiver and brought to mind an experience from the past. I turned and I walked to the other side of the bridge and I peered down into the darkness as the thudding became louder, to the point that I could actually feel it vibrate through the floor of the bridge. Unfortunately, or maybe fortunately, I couldn't see anything, as the sound of something running, something large on 2 feet, approached and passed beneath the bridge and then continued receding into the distance towards the south. I couldn't help but wonder if maybe it was heading to Mother Neff. 10 years before, some friends and I were camping at Mother Neff State Park. I'd been here for day usage, but I never actually camped. It was a beautiful park, and being Thanksgiving weekend, we were thrilled to have it all to ourselves. Even the ranger station was empty, but there was a self-serve registration counter and a slot to drop your camping fee. We set up camp, played around, and had a late lunch, and since rain was expected the next day, and we were only going to be there overnight, I wanted to do some exploring. There was a trail through the park that had once been a route that Native Americans used when traveling through the area, which was believed to have a temporary camp for them. There was a place on the route outside the park that I wanted to see on private property where we shouldn't have been going, but there were rumors that arrowheads were being found there. Considering ourselves dauntless young adventurers, we were not going to let this deter us from our quest, so off we went. Before we got out of the park, we came to a spot where the brush had been piled up across the path, and there was a sign posted there saying, "Danger, trail closed." Of course, this only served to make our adventure more alluring. We pressed on, never noticing any issue that would seem to warrant the trail being closed. We crossed the fence and ventured out of the park, but we never located the spot that we were looking for, so we headed back. It was getting late and we still had a long way to get back to camp, but we had made it back into the park, though not yet past the brush pile. At one point, one of the guys said something about what a strange place for a cow to be. We all paused and someone said that there were no cows in the state park. Then we wanted to see it, and I said that maybe it was from a neighboring farm. So my buddy pointed out where he was looking. It was in a thicket, maybe 50 yards away, and the face was the only thing standing out in the dusk, looking towards us, and it appeared to be chewing its cud. It was funny, and I still remember the pale face, like that of several local breeds, and the pinkish color of the muzzle standing out as it chewed. Then one of the guys mooed loudly, and it abruptly ceased its chewing and appeared to stare rather incredulously at us, which we found hilarious. We turned to continue on, but one of the guys in front of me still was watching the cow, and I saw the smile drop off his face and his eyes widen, and he said, "Oh my God." I turned back to look, but my buddy had grabbed my shirt and yanked me forward, saying, "We gotta go." So we took off at a trot. As we ran, we were questioning him about what was up. He finally said that was not a cow, which was weird. He said he'd tell us when we got back to camp, and since it was now getting dark, we kept going. Just before we reached the brush pile, we began to hear loud thuds and something moving through the undergrowth behind us. I thought that the cow, or not cow, was chasing us. By the time we cleared the brush and danger sign, I felt a sense of relief, like we'd crossed some sort of boundary back into the safe zone. There was the sound of wood cracking, not little sticks or twigs, but the loud sounds of large branches popping in two, and I realized something big was stepping through the brush pile. In unison, we yelled, "Run!" and the frantic race back to camp began. The heavy foot thuds behind us stopped, but we kept our pace all the way to the camp. When we got back, we collapsed, and a couple of us were even laughing, but the one guy who'd seen this thing was already snatching up his stuff, and he said, "Let's go, we got to get out of here." The rest of us were like, "What did you see?" And he said that thing was not a cow. Whatever it was, when we were laughing, it stood up on 2 feet, and it had to be 8 or 10 feet tall. I didn't know what to think. We all snatched up our stuff, broke camp, and headed back home. The whole drive home was a constant debate or argument as to what we had encountered. The next day, it all seemed ridiculous. We were stoned, we saw a stray cow, my buddy had misinterpreted what he saw, the cow, for whatever reason, decided to follow and chase us. I mean, that really did explain the whole encounter. Even so, I looked up the number for the park and I called. A ranger answered, and I told him that we had been to the park the day before. He sounded almost surprised. He was still at home and hadn't been down to the station yet to check for campers or fees. He asked, half jokingly, if we had deposited the fee, and I told him of course we did. He asked if we'd had a good time, if there had been any issues, and if we had stayed all night. He seemed to be fishing, but it was Thanksgiving weekend, and I figured that he was just wondering why I was calling. So I said that we'd had a good time, but that we'd seen a stray cow roaming loose in the park. He laughed at that and didn't seem to take it very seriously. He asked where we had seen the cow. Not wanting to tell him that we had gone past the trail closed sign, I told him the general location. His tone turned very serious. He said, "You didn't go down that closed trail, did you?" The light-hearted mood turned sober, and he asked me a lot of questions about exactly what had happened. I left out the parts about us trespassing on private land, being stoned, and what my buddy said he'd seen. I told him that we had seen a cow in the thicket and that we might have scared it or made it mad and that it had chased us. He paused a bit and then he said to never pull that kind of crap again. He told me that this section of the park was closed for a good reason and that they didn't post danger signs just for the hell of it. I apologized and said that we wouldn't do that and that I just wanted to let him know so he could figure out what to do about the cow. Then, in a real sarcastic tone, he said, "Son, I highly doubt that you saw a cow," and he hung up the phone. The park has gone through periods of being completely closed due to flood damage, reopened for limited use, closed again with no explanation, reopened but not for camping, closed again due for lack of funding, etc., and reopened again. Now, after hearing the story of the cow man, both experiences have come rushing back to me, and I can still picture that face, which gave the impression in the shape of a cow's head, and I can now imagine it was a trick of light, contrasting the pale face with the darker fur or hair, obscuring what might have been jowls, chin, and neck, with the pinkish area that I took for the cow's muzzle appearing long and narrowed by hair on the cheeks. People seem to be referring to him or something similar as the cow man, but all these years I've thought of it as the not cow man. Okay, that's a great story, and it's interesting, and I think the man is retelling a story for someone else. He titles it Billy's Story, as if Billy is a friend. But my question is, are you saying there's a beast in the woods that has a cow head? Or are you saying you mistook what you saw as a cow for maybe a Bigfoot or a dog man? I'm really not clear on what the writer is telling us here, but at any rate, it's a great story, and what's interesting to me is the park rangers know about it. The park rangers close down parts of parks, and I hear about it all the time. They'll close trails. You know, the Appalachian Trail, people hike it like crazy now. I used to want to through hike that trail when I was 10 years ago. I was actually planning a through hike, and it's so crowded now that I don't really even want to go. They close off sections of that trail for bear activity, and it kind of makes you wonder, are they really closing it for bear activity, or is it something else? But at any rate, it was a great story, and I wanted to get it on the channel, and I appreciate the man who wrote it. And if you get a chance, shoot me an email and let me know what you think this thing was. Is it a cow man? Is it a dog man? Is it a Bigfoot? Or do you even know? I'm curious, and I'm just guessing everybody else might be too. If you made it the whole 2 hours and 15 minutes of this podcast, I want to tell you thank you. I really appreciate you. If you think it's a good channel, give me a thumbs up, maybe even hit the subscribe button. Click that bell so you're alerted to every new video, and you'll get great stories every time that notification comes up. I'd appreciate it if you did that. And with that, thank you for listening to the podcast, and we'll see you on the next one. Thanks.